You know me, you know I usually, almost always, get excited about the authors I present. And at the same time, I feel some sense of despondency because I can only deliver so much in a limited amount of time. And now with Rubén Darío, I feel that despondency even from the outset, because we only have one unit compared to other writers whom we dedicate 2 units to. But nevertheless, I'll try to make the best of this. And instead of going through his life, of course I'll mention some things about his life and his works. But you can Google that. You can look it up in Wikipedia or some other article that you find about the life of Rubén Darío. But Rubén Darío is great. If you read a biography on the internet, you get quite a good idea of who he was, what he did, what he wrote, and so on, and what he matters above all. Nevertheless, I find that the most interesting things are those things that you don't find in biographies. And his life, his relationship with Francisca Sanchez, that was theme for a novel, and an actually published novel that the granddaughter of Francisca Sanchez published. And she named her book. The title of the book is La Princesa Paca. Yes. To sum up, Rubén Darío married Rafaela Contreras, whom he calls in his poetry Estela. But she died at childbirth just 2 years after they got married. And then, if you read a habitual biography, you will see that he married Rosario Murillo, and that this was an unhappy marriage to the point that he escaped all the way to Europe. He was born in Nicaragua. Okay, it's easy to remember where he was born because nowadays it's called Ciudad Darío. It can hardly be called a city, but it's Ciudad Darío that formerly was known as Metapa, and when Rubén Darío was born, it was called Chocoyo. He was born in 1867. Okay, and sorry if I am now going all over the place. So let me just put some order here. Rubén Darío was born in 1867. He was very precocious. So at the age of 3, he could read and write, and started writing poems at the age of 3. The earliest poems published, well, not published, but written by Rubén Darío are the epitaphs he wrote for some other children that died in his hometown. So that's the earliest poetry that is kept of Rubén Darío. So he was a genius, without a doubt. He was, to a significant extent, self-taught. I'm not saying that he was completely self-taught, because he did receive a significant education from the Jesuits. But his family was not very rich. And oh, by the way, there are also some very, very hurtful events when you look into his family history, because he was not raised by his father and his mother. And he thought his father to be his uncle. Because his mother, Rosario Sarmiento, could not take care of him because she was heavily maltreated by her husband, to the point that they had to give him in adoption to some relatives. And Rubén Darío thought her mother was Tia Bernarda, but she was her aunt. And when Rubén Darío was 6, he finally meets his real mother, Rosario Sarmiento. So it's a shock for Rubén Darío, who you will say, well, he was only 6, but he understood fully well. He understood fully well, especially being a precocious child, right? And this, according to some psychological analysis that have been conducted on the life and the work on Rubén Darío, this is a trauma. What can I believe? Whom can I believe? Where do I come from? Who's my family? So that's a very troubled story, and I am just summarizing it now. But it's a very, very dense and very, very sad story. But moving on, he received a good education from the Jesuits, but above all, he was a self-taught. He was a self-taught. And of course, he read the great writers of the Spanish Golden Century. And he also delved into some French writers that were the first proponents of the modernist movement. The modernist movement that eventually Rubén Darío would be the uncontestable leading figure of Spanish modernism. But modernism started in France. And Rubén Darío not only read them, but even translated some of their works and wrote essays from a very early age. And you've read some of the poems of Rubén Darío, right? You've already read some of his poems. The question that is going to sound obvious when I give you the answer, but maybe it's not so obvious now. Who do you think was his major influence, his greatest influence from the Spanish Golden Century, second only to Cervantes, of course? It could be López de Vega, but it's not López de Vega. There's an influence of López de Vega, which I will highlight soon, but even more. You're getting closer.
Góngora.
Góngora. Of course, Góngora. Do you see now why? Because of the grandiloquence of his style. Remember how Góngora used to write with those puffy words, right? Well, now look at Rubén Darío, and you find a strong similarity. Yeah. So Góngora is one of the greatest influences. Of course, there's also an influence of López de Vega, in as much as Rubén Darío has been named the poet of love. But this is a love that has been processed. He's not Dante. He's not Dante, but at the same time, it's not Love in the Times of Cholera by Garcia Marquez. So we find a middle ground. Why am I speaking here about a middle ground? In Dante, we find, of course, that the whole Divine Comedy is structured and hinges around love. Okay? The farther we depart from love, the deeper we sink in hell. The more we love, the closer we are to that love that moves the sun and all the other stars as the Divine Comedy finishes. Right? I think this is clear. In Dante, that is love. So all of the Divine Comedy is structured around love. But it's an idealized love to a significant extent. Or if you want to call it like this, it's a spiritualized love. It's a theological love. In Garcia Marquez, at least in what I can say about love in times of cholera, that love is something completely carnal and it can hardly be called love. I really don't recommend Love in Times of Cholera. It's a great narrative, but it's so crude in so many aspects. And you stumble upon this theme over and over again. Now, what's love for Rubén Darío? In Rubén Darío, we find this sensuous and voluptuous love, which nevertheless is not raw passion. It's processed. And you can see that this love has been elaborated, has been refined, and he sings to love. Just so you get an idea, the first time he proposed, he was 14. And he was turned down. But he was precocious in everything, even in his love life. And this is something that he elaborates as a poet. So in Rubén Darío, of course, you will see that not all of his poems speak about love, but you will see that love is a constant theme. So that's something that he owes in a significant way to Lope de Vega. Not only, but Lope de Vega is a strong influence in Rubén Darío too. Then there was the possibility for him to study in Spain with a scholarship, and he was entitled to the scholarship that the Nicaraguan government could give him, but he didn't get it. Why? Because the poem he presented to contend for the scholarship was too anti-clerical, too contrary to the church, and too contrary to the Jesuits, whom Rubén Darío knew well enough to criticize. That's the reason why, at least at this point in his life, Rubén Darío could not go to Europe, and he could not study in Europe. Nevertheless, he was able to travel to Chile. It's interesting when you look at documentaries, and of course Rubén Darío is a celebrated figure in Chile, he's a celebrated figure in Argentina, of course he's a celebrated figure in Nicaragua, he's a celebrated figure in Spain, and it's interesting to see how everyone claims Rubén Darío for himself. They say Chile was his second homeland, but Buenos Aires received him. And most of his life he spent it in Spain. So they all want Rubén Darío for himself. Mexico has no great claims. So yeah, Rubén Darío did visit Mexico, but it didn't end well. Because he came to Mexico, he went to Mexico for the first centenary of the Mexican independence. And what was happening in 1910 in Mexico? Exactly. So he came to Mexico forming part of a legacy from Nicaragua to congratulate the Mexican authorities. And where are the Mexican authorities? It went so bad that Rubén Darío even attempted suicide when he was in Mexico. So it's not like he had a lot to... He didn't have strong bonds with Mexico. Nevertheless, you see that he knew Mexican poetry also very well. And in the Ode to Roosevelt that you have in the anthology, he praises Nezahualcóyotl and Cuauhtémoc. Okay, so of course he appreciated Mexican poetry. And when he moved to France, to Paris, with his lover, Francisca Sanchez, he was living in biting poverty. You remember one of his poems about the poet who puts in his verses the jewels, the gold, the diamonds, but when he finishes writing, the poet hungers. The poet starves to death, right? So that's a personal situation. And he moved to Paris with Francisca Sanchez, and since he was so poor, he encountered someone else who was sharing his poverty, and they shared an apartment. Who was that? Amado Nervo. No. Yes, they shared an apartment. He, Francisca Sanchez, and Amado Nervo shared an apartment. So it's impressive to see how he corresponded and became friends, and sometimes he also became enemies with so many great literary figures. From the outset, when he came to Madrid, he became great friends with Menéndez Pelayo. That was before the disaster of 1898. The disaster of 1898. You all know what I'm referring to. You don't know what I'm referring to? Spanish-American War. Spain still claimed to be an empire, even after the independence of the Americas, because they held the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Did Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines became independent of their own accord? No. America, meaning the United States, pushed for their independence. And Spain lost. I mean, they didn't have anything. They didn't stand a chance. So it is then when Spain becomes aware of themselves and they realize that they've fallen into a crisis of identity, because Spain had risen as a nation and as an empire, as an empire. So for Spain, being a nation and being an empire was one and the same thing. When they lose their colonies, they come to the realization that they're no longer an empire. So who are we? So in his second trip to Spain, Darío encounters a very changed Spain. Nevertheless, it's Spain that is teeming with young writers like Valle Inclán, Antonio and Manuel Machado, Baroja, Unamuno, eventually also Juan Ramón Jiménez, although he was way younger, he would also hop on board. And Juan Ramón Jiménez was a great admirer of Rubén Darío. He called him my king. And Rubén Darío also praised Juan Ramón Jiménez with his first book, but Juan Ramón Jiménez, let's say it like this, he was too ambitious. And although he was like 21, and he was already a renowned figure within modernism, he didn't want to frame himself within the modernistic movement, and he transcended the boundaries of any movement. Just so you see that Rubén Darío also had some sense of humor. In one of his fights with Miguel de Unamuno, he insulted him, he debased him, he said in a pejorative way, in a demeaning way, "You're an Indian." So the next time Rubén Darío writes to Miguel de Unamuno, he says, "I'm plucking a feather from my penacho to write to you." Or when Valle Inclán, who, by the way, is the one who went together with Rubén Darío to that lost town in the outskirts of Avila, and it's then when they encountered Francisca Sánchez, who became Rubén Darío's love for his lifetime, for all the rest of his life. Due to an accident, I think, or a malpractice in a medical procedure, Valle Inclán lost his arm. So after that, with some sense of humor, Rubén Darío said, "Well, we already have a one-armed great writer," and things went very well for him. Cervantes, of course. So there's a lot of fun, and of course you don't find these anecdotes in Wikipedia. In Wikipedia you find just facts, but I think that the most interesting thing, and that which spices this dish, is precisely those little facts that you find scattered here and there. And I could go on and on speaking about those scattered facts, but just to open your appetite. Francisca Sánchez, she was a very devout Catholic. So you will ask yourselves, so why did she end up living with Rubén Darío? Because he didn't tell her. He was married. At first. And when he told her, it was way too late. But on the other hand, you say, well, he was married. Yes, but how was he married? The family of Rosario Murillo got Rubén Darío completely drunk, and it was then when they married him. Yes, exactly. So he struggled all of his lifetime to disentangle himself from this marriage where they had put him. He even went to Rome and pleaded with Pope Leo XIII to have his marriage annulled. And Pope Leo XIII said, "But that was a civil marriage. Why do you involve me?" So he had to go back to Nicaragua to see if they could change the law to have his marriage and well, to get the divorce, because that was a legal battle. It had nothing to do with ecclesiastical issues. Unfortunately for Rubén Darío, he could change the law, but that law didn't apply to him. So he ended up, at least officially, married to Rosario Murillo. The love of his life was Francisca Sanchez. From that little town in Madrid. She died aged almost 90 in 1963. 1963. And you know who got to know her life and especially her relationship with Rubén Darío better than anyone else? A young student who back then was living in Spain, Mario Vargas Llosa. Yes, Mario Vargas Llosa went and visited her, knowing she was the former lover of Rubén Darío. The last telegram Rubén Darío wrote to her said, "I'm going to die, so you're going to be able to receive communion once again." Nevertheless, she prayed the rosary every day. Yes, and Rosario Murillo, in some of the biographies, is depicted as a witch, meaning she even came up with some witchcraft to damn Rubén Darío. But when Rubén Darío left Spain, first he, in 1914 or 15, I'm not sure, right after the outbreak of World War I, he spent some time in Colombia, New York. He was already very ill. He died aged 49 from hepatic cirrhosis. Yeah, he was also a heavy drinker. And in Colombia, the ship journey wore him out. He was already sick. So they talked him into coming to the States, and they told him that here in the States he could deliver a conference about peace, and he did at the University of Columbia, hoping, and they raised his expectations, perhaps too much. They told him that with that he was going to end World War I. He didn't. But nevertheless, he delivered the conference in 1915. Then he went to Guatemala to spend just a few months there, and he died back in Nicaragua. And who tended for him? Rosario Murillo. So, the more you study and the more you become familiarized with these events, the more confused you get. Because at first I said, okay, he reconciled with Rosario Murillo and he came to terms, well, she's my wife, at least according to the law, so this is what I have to do and I have to comply with this, and at least she's going to take care of me. So I thought it was a happy ending story. Nevertheless, maybe Rosario Murillo, yes, she tended for him, but at the same time, she tended for him with some evil intent, because she wanted to get the recognition or the money or something that she wanted to get from Rubén Darío. Yes. And by the way, those controversies, those gossips continue even to our days with the descendants of one and the other family, who's really entitled to the legacy of Rubén Darío. Mm-hmm. Yes. But I think I didn't give you year-to-year biography, but I think now you get a sense of what an interesting life he had. Yes. You can say, well, it's just, maybe it's spiced up a little for the novel, because there's a novel written about Rubén Darío and Francisca Sanchez. Yes, but at least the template, the structure, is real. Okay, and that's something worth remarking. Yes, brother.
So the people that he was with first,
Rafaela Contreras was his first wife. She died 2 years after they got married, and she died at childbirth.
Okay, and then after that?
Rosario Murillo.
Rosario Murillo, but at the same time, Francisca
Yes. Rosario Murillo, he married her when he was completely drunk. Then he went to Spain, and it is in Spain where in some lost town close to Avila, he had to go by donkey, so you understand. So there were not even roads to get there, but he met the love of his life, who was Francisca Sanchez. Okay? And I was going to say, and these are the three women that come in Rubén Darío's life, but really, no. Any woman he met, he fell in love with. Las mujeres de Argentina son divinas. Y las del Uruguay, ay. So, yes, it would be an understatement to say that those are the three women that he encountered in his life or that he had some relationship with. Yes. From a very early age. Remember, he was 14 when he proposed to an actress who worked at a circus. So the circus came to Chacoyo, and he immediately fell in love with her, and he proposed to her. And of course, who's this child? She didn't know that child was a genius, but nevertheless, that was his first attempt. Good. Why is Rubén Darío important? Above all, he is the chief leading figure of Spanish modernism, to the point that no one can even rival with him. To him is also credited the renewal of literature and the independence of Hispanic American literature. You could say that the Americas gained their political independence in the early 1800s, but it is thanks to Rubén Darío that the Americas gained their literary independence. And Leopoldo Lugones, an Argentinian poet, also speaks high praises of Rubén Darío, calling him the last libertador. Meaning, he almost pairs him with Simón Bolívar and Martí and maybe Miguel Hidalgo and some other great figures of the independence of the Americas. Angel Rama, in one of his studies, writes, it's a translation I made, his aesthetic has been abolished. His precious lexicon has been left aside. His topics have been left behind. Nevertheless, he's still highly influential. And it's worth remarking that nowadays, before and after Rubén Darío, nobody writes like Rubén Darío. Nobody resorts to the themes Rubén Darío resorted to. But nevertheless, he's highly influential, he's highly studied. And what is this renewal? If you compare Spanish language with Italian or English or French, definitely it's a coarse language. It's harsh. We've said that, right? So maybe one of the first movements of independence of the Spanish language happened with Becker, because he realized that we cannot constrain our Spanish language into those Italian molds. With all due respect to the Spanish Golden Century. They followed Italian molds, they did what they could with those models, but I think that the first emancipation of Spanish literature happens with Becker, and what does he do? He leaves aside those models and tries to come up with new models that maybe are a little looser, but nevertheless, they are more appropriate for Spanish as a language. A second elaboration would be that enacted by Rubén Darío. Because Rubén Darío, noticing that stress is so important in Spanish language, uses that stress to give some intense rhythm to his poetry. I would say, and then I will take it back, but let me say it first. I would say Rubén Darío realizes that Spanish is the language where you hit every consonant, and every stressed syllable is overtly stressed. So if this is how Spanish is of itself as a language, let's use these devices to hit everything, and then we'll end up with some very resonant poetry. Su trueno sonoro, su cálido coro que envuelve en un trueno de oro la augusta soberbia de los pabellones. Okay? Now, I take it back. Why do I take it back? Because definitely there's rhythm in the poetry of Rubén Darío, which doesn't mean you hit it. Of course, if you recite it like this, los frenos que mascan los fuertes caballos de guerra, of course, you are going to end up hitting every syllable, but I don't think that's how Rubén Darío intended his poetry to be read. There's rhythm, which doesn't mean he hits poetry. Okay? And it is thanks to, I think her name is Susana. The study and the lecture I saw by Susana Chela, that it's written C-E-L-L-A, from Argentina. She made me realize that the poetry of Rubén Darío is graceful. Why is he important? Let me continue with this question. We cannot settle in positivism. The late 1800s had seen the rise of positivism, and along with positivism came realism in literature. Nevertheless, that positivism is rivaled, and it's contested in philosophy by Schopenhauer's pessimism and by Nietzsche's vitalism. In literature, we will also come with some reactions against that realism, and that is something characteristic of the 20th century. You see that commonality. Practically all movements react against realism, although they react in different ways. The way Machado reacts against realism is not the way Unamuno reacts against realism and positivism. And at the same time, is not the way Rubén Darío reacts against it. A study written by Selena Millares challenges the claim that Rubén Darío was trying to escape. Of course, you can see in Rubén Darío some attempts to escape that reality and flee into some ideal realm like the Far East or pre-Hispanic America or the French Rococo. Those are his most common themes, right? If you call this escaping to an empty rhetoric or to a form deprived of content, definitely that's not Rubén Darío. Of course, he gives a lot of importance to the form, and he highlights the form. And I would say, to some extent, sometimes the form overpasses and is even more important than the content itself. Sometimes, not always, in Rubén Darío. If you compare the intimacy of Rubén Darío with that of Antonio Machado or even of Becker, you will see that Rubén Darío is left far behind. But that doesn't mean that his poetry is empty. In addition, you have to consider that there's an evolution in Rubén Darío. His first great book was Azul, meaning blue. He was 20 when he published it in Chile. To that follows Prosas Profanas. He called Azul was the beginning of my spring. Prosas Profanas was my full spring. And finally, he wrote Cantos de Vida y Esperanza, where you find the litany to our Lord Don Quixote. That he calls his autumn, not in a sense of decay and decline, but in a sense of ripeness. And the fruits, and the harvest, and the aromas, all of it come together in his Cantos de Vida y Esperanza. So when you read Cantos de Vida y Esperanza, you see that he definitely has some lyricism. If you compare it with other poets, you will definitely say, well, some other poets surpass Rubén Darío's lyricism. I have no problem with accepting that. But that doesn't mean that Rubén Darío is empty or that he's deprived of content. He's, by all means, he's very reflective. He reflects about life. He reflects about politics. He reflects about love. He reflects about poetry. So there's a lot of reflection, and you can draw a lot of content from the poetry of Rubén Darío. We still have a few minutes. Are there any questions, or do you want me to talk a little about some of his poems? Should we talk about The Princess or Ode to Roosevelt? Roosevelt, okay. Roosevelt. This poem was written in Cantos de Vida, meaning his most mature works. And he wrote it in 1904. What happened in 1904 in America? Elections. And who won those elections? Roosevelt. If we go a little back in history, we see that there had been some attempts of colonization from the US to the rest of America. Just like European nations were rivaling against one another to gain colonies in Africa and in Asia, in the same way, who was going to be the conqueror, or who was going to be the empire that was going to have the Americas as their colonies? And you remember when we read Moby Dick, Herman Melville says, Mexico is a loose fish for the United States. They can take it whenever they want. It's also a fact that the US had bases in Veracruz, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, in Panama, and of course in Cuba and in Puerto Rico. They could take those territories whenever they wanted. You remember the Plan Marshall, America for the Americans, right? No, that's not the Plan Marshall. The Plan Marshall came in World War II. Please remember this and get your history right. What was America for the Americans? Monroe Doctrine. America for the Americans. It was not phrased like this, but that was the idea. And I ask you a question. When there's an ambiguity, America for the Americans. What is America? The continent. Who are the Americans? Right? I think now you all see it clearly. And in the War of 1847, they had taken more than half of the Mexican territory. Some of them wanted to get all of Mexico. Why not? Some say it was because of racism. While taking Texas and Colorado and so on, California and so on, that were not densely populated, was not an issue. Getting all the way to southern Mexico, that would have been an issue. That's one of the theories or conjectures I read or I studied, or that some of my professors taught me. Another important thing was the American Civil War. If they had taken Mexico, Mexico would have sided with the South. So that was not in the interests of Washington. So that's another important point. Yes. Eventually, moving ahead a few decades, World War I. So that distracted the U.S. from Mexico. Yes. But the more I've studied about this, I have not completely discarded all these theories, but put them in a parenthesis. You know, in my opinion, what was the most important thing? Why the U.S. The most important reason why the U.S. didn't expand as an imperialist potency? It was internal pressure. It was the pressure from the American people. Many Americans didn't want to envision themselves as the counterpart of their European, as the counterpart of European nations who had created empires. And that was also a hot topic in politics. Democrats against Republicans. And Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican. And in his campaign, he favored a lot colonialism. You can even see the caricatures that have been made of Roosevelt in those times while he was campaigning. Like, by the way, he was also a hunter, so you can understand some of these caricatures, and at the same time, the very ode to Roosevelt, because it's addressed to a hunter. Instead, Democrats were very contrary to this. And by the way, Mark Twain also was very critical of any attempts of American colonialism. Yes. In the end, regardless of what he had said in his campaign, Theodore Roosevelt dedicated himself to internal affairs, and the fears of Rubén Darío didn't crystallize. But nevertheless, he left this ode to Roosevelt, which, of course, he didn't intend for Roosevelt to read it. I don't know if Roosevelt read it at all. That was for the people of Nicaragua. He addressed his ode to Roosevelt to the people of Nicaragua, telling them, we might go into war. We might even be invaded. But nevertheless, don't forget what are your core values. And let me just finish this. You have everything, but you lack something. You lack God. The first thing that causes some interference with that is you have everything, but you lack something. So like God is one among many other things. His vision of God. Second, was he thinking of a transcendent personal God? Maybe he was. But maybe he was just referring to culture and values. That's another possible reading. And finally, definitely you can see in Rubén Darío someone who opposes materialism. In Rubén Darío, you see a strong quest for transcendence. Maybe you would even say it's too strong, too intense, to the point that he experiments with everything that he comes across. He visited the Carthusians, yes, but at the same time he had some sense of spiritism and witchcraft and masonry, so he blended everything together, and that was his own spirituality. Okay, and I know that I've diverted many times, but I hope this was educational for you, especially knowing that beyond the mere facts that you can learn about his life, there's much more to it. Okay, so thank you very much.